Okay, great. We've got some more people with us now. Thanks for coming. I'm sure people will trickle in as we go, but welcome everyone to the August event of the Scholars Library series. So as most of you know, each month this initiative allows an alum to come and talk about their literary works to those within the Rhodes community and also beyond that as well. So thanks for taking the time to come along. And today we're really excited to welcome Subhashish to talk about his book, Caged Tiger. And fellow Rhodes scholar Lucas is here to moderate the conversation. Lucas is a DPhil candidate and an examination fellow at All Souls, and his current research is on China and international organisations in the mid-20th century. So without further ado, I will hand over to Lucas, who's going to give you a further introduction to Subhashish and the session, and we can get into it. Please have a think and post any questions you might have in the chat as we go, and we can fit them into the Q&A section at the end, towards the end of the hour. But thank you all for coming, and over to you, Lucas.
Thanks, Georgie. So I was just telling Subhashish that I feel so lucky that he's speaking with us today. He said that 9:30 p.m. In India is not too late for him, but I'm usually totally comatose by then. So props to you, and really looking forward to the conversation. So just a very quick intro. Subhashish, as you all know already, is the author of this book, Caged Tiger: How Too Much Government is Holding Indians Back. He's an economist by training, and he has worked in cross-policy and corporate fields, including the management consulting firm McKinsey, venture capital firm Omidyar Network, and currently the FinTech Startup Club. He received an MPhil in economics from Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship, and his bachelor's degree was in economics as well. So I think the format we're going to do today is that Subhashish has actually very kindly prepared some introductory remarks to introduce the book, the project, as well as some of the questions I think that he would find most interesting to discuss in this community. And then I think I'll kick us off with some questions, but I think this can be a very lively discussion. I imagine people will have questions, so I think as much time as possible we can devote to a kind of all-round discussion of the book's themes and implications as well. So over to you, Subhashish. Thank you so much for being here and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you for the introduction, Lucas. I'll try to share my screen and walk through this. Excellent. So while I don't know how many of you have actually had the chance to go through the blurb of the book, but the book is written with a fairly kind of India-centric audience in mind, even though it's written in a way that's hopefully accessible to non-Indians as well. However, I think there are certain themes in the book as I was writing it, which emerged, which I'm sure are true for many different kinds of post-colonial states, specifically those that were ruled by the British, but possibly even others. And in this opening remarks, I want to draw out some of those so that hopefully those who see it, hear this either live or see it later, can actually reflect on whether some of these aspects that I thought emerged in India's institutional design are actually true for other post-colonial states as well. So to start with a little bit of a trajectory of what's the kind of line of argument that emerges if we kind of abstract away from India and start looking at the message of the book in the context of post-colonial states in general. First and foremost, the fact that a lot of the laws and institutions as they're written in these states today emerged in the colonial times. When they emerged in the colonial times, there was a different standard used for British citizens of that time and a different standard used for Indian or other colonial subjects. So one of the examples that I want to take up is the sedition law, which essentially says that you cannot criticize or you cannot try to overthrow the government. Obviously, that standard varies itself. But at the time that India had that sedition law introduced by the British in the early 1900s, the standard use was extremely different between someone who was undergoing sedition charges in the UK at that time and in India at that time. So for example, in the UK at that time, only a direct incitement to violence could be counted as sedition. Whereas in India at that time, and in fact even today, there are more ambiguous offenses such as disaffection against the state. And in fact, Gandhi is famously said to have remarked that that is essentially the duty of a citizen, is to be disaffected by the state, but that was criminalized by the British. Similarly, in Britain at that time, sedition was punishable only with a 2-year term, and it was bailable. Whereas in India of that time, it was non-bailable, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was one of India's foremost freedom fighters, was actually sentenced to 6 years, including being in a different country, which was Myanmar. Similarly, in Britain, if you had to be convicted of sedition at that time, you had to be unanimously held guilty by the jury. Whereas at Tilak's trial, in fact, a 6-3 verdict in favor of conviction with the all 3 Indian members not holding him guilty was sufficient to convict him. So you see that because you treat free citizens of the UK very differently from the colonial subjects of India, you kind of introduce laws that are similar but actually very different in the substance of it. And that's not just about sedition. I think there are a whole bunch of such laws that were introduced by the British, either on the same standard or different standards, which funnily Britain has done away with, but India continues to retain. One of them, for example, is criminal defamation, which was abolished in the UK in 2009. And the last conviction, in fact, happened significantly before that. In fact, even Kenya has done away with criminal defamation, but in India, it's actually used very frequently, especially against political opponents. In fact, India's foremost opposition leader, I believe at last count, had 17 such criminal defamation. So while defamation exists in most countries, it's usually a civil crime wherein you kind of pay a fine and get out of it. India is one of the few countries where you actually have to go to jail if you defame someone. Sedition is something I've spoken about. In India, in fact, we see an increasing trend in the use of sedition cases. There were 76 registered in 2021 compared to 30 in 2015. Unlawful assembly essentially says that you cannot have more than a certain number of people who are congregating in a public space. In any democracy, obviously, citizens congregate all the time for both political and non-political reasons, because of which in the UK it was abolished in 1986. But in India, just in a single city of Delhi, it was used 6,100 times in just within a year. Now, mind you, that of these 6,100 times it was used in Delhi, the vast majority was for everyday purposes, like saying, hey, we are having an examination, we don't want kids to cheat, and therefore we'll impose these kind of restrictions. And you would be amused about the kind of things that actually necessitate or lead to a section, what in India is called a section 144, are all kinds of fairly administrative tasks, because it's easier to have a section 144. I think the government uses that quite often. And finally, blasphemy. While India is not necessarily seen as one of those states where blasphemy is used very often, but actually it is, and it's used against both sides of the political spectrum. So these are some examples of laws that the British have now done away with, but India continues to retain it from colonial times. In fact, one might argue that these get worse over time. So the sedition law that I spoke about, where one of India's freedom fighters was actually convicted under it, in many ways has become worse. So while to convict that freedom fighter, the British at that time had required an judicial warrant, that was done away with in 1973. So as of today in India, you can be arrested under the sedition law without a prior judicial warrant. And that is a significant way in which things have become worse. At the time of independence, the Indian constitution did not forbid anyone saying that, hey, look, we don't want to be part of India, and having a political plank such as that. But starting 1963, no political party in India can actually say that we don't want to be part of India. So a whole bunch of these other laws that have actually in many ways gotten worse. Obviously, I don't mean or even intend to say that all laws have gotten worse. In fact, for most laws have become better, but there are these examples of laws that become worse over time. And the reason that this is a shared colonial and legal heritage is a very simple example. The law that criminalizes homosexuality, which is section 377 of the Penal Code. India recently did away with it in about 2018 or so, if I remember correctly. But that very same numbering of section 377 is actually shared by a whole bunch of former British colonies in the region. So Pakistan, exactly section 377 criminalizes homosexuality. Same with Bangladesh, same with Malaysia. One of them was supposed to be Myanmar. And in Sri Lanka, it's called section 365. So you see a whole bunch of these post-colonial states in the Southeast Asia region, which have literally just taken that section 377 and have it in their statute. Now, given that a whole bunch of these post-colonial states have this feature wherein they have laws that they are inheriting from the British, what are the basic features of these laws? Because that's what we see continue in a whole bunch of even new laws that these countries introduced. So there are 4 that I could identify, and I'm using the police as an example. Firstly, these laws have fewer constraints on government. So, for example, they do that by using vague words. The police in India is meant to keep the peace. Nobody really knows what that means. There's a lot of subjectivity. The second is that there's a lot of focus on following orders. The reason that happens is because in British times, obviously the British did not have enough personnel to actually have the entire police force. So it's the elite of the police force who were British, and the vast majority were Indian constables. And if you want to keep them in disciplined ways and run them as a unit that serves the colonial project, then you have to make sure that all of these masses are actually following orders. So that's what is listed as first among the duties of an Indian policeman, is to follow orders. The third is that you want to control all of these, the vast majority of the police force, you actually tie them up in paperwork. So as of today, some Indian states have their police people actually fill out about 250 plus documents at the station level. So there's a lot of the infamous Indian bureaucracy, which I'm sure a lot of other countries share as well, in many ways has this colonial heritage. And finally, and most importantly, because the British were ruling from a few different states and did not trust local governments or even invest in developing local governments, modern Indian institutions in many ways are controlled by a distant power. And I'm sure this is true for other post-colonial states as well, wherein a local police would be controlled by a provincial or a national headquarter rather than the local community. And this is something I go into a lot more detail about in the book and show the difference between how things are now run in the UK and the US, which I take as 2 frequent examples, and how they're run in India. So that becomes the superstructure. And I believe this is not only in the form of the written word of the law, but also in terms of how institutions are designed, what kind of processes they follow. So many different aspects of the colonial heritage actually come over to these kind of laws. That in India's case got exacerbated by the circumstances of our independence. Remember that when we were coming into being a free country in 1947, there was economic stagnation, recurring starvation. So the country was tempted to adopt socialism. Socialism obviously implies greater government control. There was caste discrimination. There was economic inequality, because of which the fundamental rights in India, unlike those in the US, are not absolute. They have a lot of restrictions. They have a lot of conditions which weaken fundamental rights substantially. In fact, one of the people who actually was part of the Constituent Assembly said these fundamental rights seem to have been written from the viewpoint of a police constable. And finally, because we had the trauma of partition and the kind of diversity that the country had, we created a very powerful center and bestowed it with a whole bunch of excessive powers. And I'm sure that obviously the circumstance of India is both very different from other countries, but I'm sure a lot of countries share at least some of these features, because a lot of post-colonial states were born in economic stagnation, were born in economic inequality, were born in some kind of cataclysmic geopolitical event. And this is the crux of the book, which is to say that given that you've designed your institutions in a very centralized way, there's a lot of intervention that happens in the economic, cultural, political, and societal lives of your citizens, which in most cases, or in many cases, tend to be excessive. So I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but just point to all the kinds of interferences that I speak about in the book. And finally, here's what I say, that the solution is for us to actually start looking at those colonial features of the laws, of colonial design choices, and start undoing them. And the way we undo it is by creating a political executive that has clear powers and is bound in rules and procedures that can be reviewed at high frequency by a different political power. So unlike, for example, in the US, where you have the executive and the legislature fairly separated out, in India and in many other countries which adopted the British parliamentary system, they're fused at the hip without necessarily having the kind of enabling environment that the UK has to actually hold that entity accountable. And finally, we need a political executive that is accountable to the people, legislation, and courts. So these 3 principles, which I again show through examples about how they can be applied in different parts of an Indian's life, is what I call the principles of good institutions. And I'm sure Obviously, this misses a lot of nuance, but in some form, shape, or manner might actually be relevant for other post-colonial states as well. And I finally end the book by talking about, we know what to do, how do we go about doing it? And that's when I talk about the channels of institutional evolution, where I talk about public opinion and its shape and the role it plays in putting soft guardrails around institution, and similarly capital mobility as well in a globalized capitalistic world. And then I talk about hard guardrails. I talk about the history of mass mobilization in India, the pros and cons of getting institutional change through mass mobilization, and using courts as a way of improving institutional architecture. And finally, I end with this, because this is the final message of the book, that unfortunately, good institutional design is not sufficient. So, and I'm sure all of us have seen this in the US, where you can design the best constitution or what you believe is the best constitution with adequate checks and balances, but that is no guarantee that things will actually hold. That there's no universal template for liberty, and every generation in a way has to keep playing this template and start holding its government accountable, and that you get prosperity only when you need to have a strong state. You need to empower the state to be able to do good, but you also need to empower society to be able to check its worst excesses. So that's the point that I wanted to make as opening remarks. And Lucas, over to you for any questions that you've come up with.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Subhashish. I'm sure everyone has got questions and thoughts to throw into the ring. So I'll just start with a couple, and then hopefully we can get a discussion going. In either people can speak or put questions in the chat. I think we can go through whatever channels people are comfortable with. So thank you so much again, Subhashish, for speaking with us. If I could start with one thing I really appreciated about the book is you tried to bring us back through this sweeping history of colonial legislation, as well as the post-colonial moment, in which you have these massive pressures, and you kind of want us to understand why the centralization of Indian governance took place in the way it did. And you point out a lot of the maybe unintended consequences decades on of that centralization. And there seem to be some unfortunate aspects of that. But I also want to maybe ask you to return a bit to maybe the emancipatory aspects of that post-colonial moment. And yes, liberty is a very important part of society, but so is justice. And it seems like the emphasis on justice was very primary and massive in that moment, whether it's Article 38 or it's, or as kind of all the different aspects that you pointed out just now. So how can we sift through the demands in that moment on the Indian government and pick out what are the aspects that are still resonant and important today, and what are the ones that we can move on from?
So I'll make two brief points before I get into the details. One is I absolutely believe that the design choices that were made in 1947 were quite likely appropriate for that time. I remember the last British commander-in-chief of India expressed doubts whether the Indian state and the Indian project would hold together. And I think that's true certainly for a lot of African post-colonial countries as well, wherein because of their ethnic diversity, there are fundamental questions of whether the country will hold or not. So that centralization probably was a right choice at that point in time. The second point is that at some level, I think liberty and equality can almost, or equality/justice can almost be seen as somewhat competing on a very practical level. That if you want a government that wants to empower itself to be a reformative agent in society, then at some level it will have to trample on human liberties in some way. So with that said, I think there's also a question that one must ask about state capacity, and especially countries where, because of the historical context, we just haven't had enough decades to build out state capacity at a level that we can start enforcing projects, even of social reformation, as well as some other countries with better state capacity would do. Therefore, through all of this, I think there were very important reasons why this project of equality and liberty was really important, was something that the state empowered itself to do. Let's just take a couple of them, right? Let's talk about India's welfare programs. Now, India's welfare programs, just if you look at the numbers of how much India spends on it as a percentage of GDP, is already low. So even today, with all the accusations the Indian government gets about, having this massive social welfare program, it's actually not that large if you just look at the pure fiscal outlay. But the Indian government had to construct, because because infrastructure was so missing, the Indian government had to essentially say, look, I'm going to step in and provide all of that. And that's when we built this entire apparatus. The government got into public service provisioning, etc. We could not do like a cash transfer program because we had people who did not have bank accounts, who did not have literacy. You had to pay them in kind. So because of all of that, an apparatus had to build, which in many ways has been credited with lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, or even preventing people from getting into catastrophic events which might be related to health or otherwise. So I think that, for example, was a very major emancipatory lens or implication of an expansive Indian government. The second I want to speak about is in terms of caste discrimination. That it was a very deliberate choice to say that, look, you will have no caste discrimination. And at some point then affirmative action was introduced, first in the legislature, then in even jobs, etc. And the scope of that was expanded over time. And this has allowed a lot of people from previously marginalized classes to rise and have more of a political voice, have more of a social voice. And that might not have happened if the government did not, for example, have reservations of affirmative action. So lots of important reasons to have done that, which is why I say that, look, because these principles of equality and liberty can sometimes be contradictory, therefore you need good institutions, you need transparent institutions that navigate that somewhat subjective decision much better. And that's the point I'm trying to make in the book.
Perfect, thank you. I'm glad to get into some of the details, because I mean, kind of through the details, we see these themes, kind of boil over and turn over. I wanted to push you a bit more on your subtitle. So how too much government is holding Indians back, or for this conversation we can even generalize, not just Indians but maybe all kinds of societies. And I want to kind of push you a bit on threading the line between too much government and too poor government, or inefficient or poor governance. When you do make comparative remarks in the book, it is often in relation to the US, which you seem to find institutionally interesting, and I mean for very good reasons. But in relation to your subtitle, I couldn't help thinking comparatively eastward rather than westward. So to some of the kind of stories of the kind of developmental state in East Asia, and also partly because the period when the kind of developmental state emerges in its modern guise in East Asia is more similar to post-colonial India than the American kind of counterpart. And it seems like, as your last chart suggests, we might have more than a few reasons to be wary of the kind of despotic Leviathan case of China. But certainly there are other economies and societies, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, where you actually have a very strong state-led development model that then is arguably compatible with a transition to a society where most liberties are enshrined in law. And so I wonder how that comparison sits with your thinking, and whether there is a way to conceive of the state in Indian society as having that transitional rather than entrenched role.
That's a fantastic question, Lucas, because it's also become a very important policy question in India, and I'm sure in other countries as well. India, for example, recently reintroduced licenses for laptops and other such goods. And obviously, in today's day and age, people are wondering, hey, is this a throwback to the socialist times where we now suddenly have the licensing regime back? And a lot of people have been arguing that, no, look, this is the only way for us to actually build up an electronic industry, because we've been left behind, and only by putting up these walls can we actually support a domestic industry. And that kind of somewhat protected state-led industrialization was a template that, as you rightly said, was used in Africa. It was used in East Asia quite frequently, and that model also came with some sort of political suppression, and we see that in fact in some form, shape, or might even continue today, though many countries have done away with it. Now, here's my challenge with that. My challenge with that is that it becomes difficult to fully make that transition from saying that, hey, look, we are going to be doing this for till such and such milestones are achieved, and then we are going to flip the switch and come back to being an extremely liberal country. Singapore, for example, is extremely wealthy, but I think on a whole bunch of liberal values does very poorly. So it's clearly very difficult to flip the switch all the way back. We will see how things play out in China. We will see how things play out in other parts of East Asia, but it's not as easy as that. And especially, therefore, when state capacity is limited, I think that's something for us to be wary about. It's good as a kickstarting the industrialization engine, but can become problematic thereafter. Therefore, in that context, returning to the point around the subtitle of my book, if I could have my way, I would call it "How Too Much Unaccountable, Non-Transparent Government Holds India Back," but obviously that would make for a very lengthy title. Instead, I would say when I say too much government, I'm really only talking about too much of the political executive. In fact, in everything apart from, and when I say political executive, it's literally the ministers, and that paraphernalia. But if you look at apart from that and look at the government apparatus more broadly, we talk about the police, we talk about the judiciary, etc. In fact, I might argue that India has too little government. That we have too few bureaucrats. And part of the reason I believe that India has too little government is because our institutional structure is built to serve the political executive rather than necessarily citizens at all points.
Perfect. So we're about half hour past the mark, and I've got more questions, and I'm happy to jump in anytime. But I thought, to kind of open it up, since I could, talk all day with Subhashish about these things. And so if you've got any questions, either pop your hand up in the, do the little raise hand symbol, or say so in the chat. I probably can't see everyone as well as I can. And I could either read your question out loud from the chat, or if you are able to ask it yourself, you're very welcome to. But in the meantime, while everyone's thinking of their question, so there was one aspect of the way you ended, or there was one theme towards the end of the book that I found very interesting, which is the right to privacy. And I was actually super fascinated by that and wanted to know more about that. Could you just say a bit about, insofar as there has been progress made on this right, how have advocates for the right to privacy successfully framed the case to achieve that progress, and what do you see as the primary obstacles to more fully enshrining that right?
So Lucas, in general, of the 4 channels of institutional change that I have spoken about, most of the movement or most of the institutional evolution or progression has actually come from the judiciary, which is not unexpected, I think, for developing countries such as India, because citizenry has more fundamental issues around livelihoods, etc., to care about. I think political mobilization is somewhat of a luxury good. So to the extent that political mobilization happens only on extremely emotive issues, the judiciary becomes the vanguard of institutional change and progression. In the case of the right to privacy, I think a whole bunch of things successfully came together. There was an introduction of a digital ID system called Aadhaar, which is the world's largest digital ID system by probably quite a margin, which then led to a whole bunch of fears in a whole bunch of communities, which could then lead to some sort of political mobilization. The second thing was that this was framed in the context of constitutional values. It wasn't framed as something that's absolutely new. So privacy was framed as a question of human autonomy, of human liberty, etc., and these constitutional values which already exist in the Indian constitution. Because of that, I think they were able to make a very successful case before the Supreme Court. In fact, even the public mobilization part of it was fairly important, because we do have evidence from the US, and I'm sure it's true in other countries as well, that the public mood on a certain issue actually affects the extent to which the courts of the land actually give judgments. So therefore, because of this political mobilization and framing within constitutional values, I think the privacy movement saw greater uptake. And I think it's the kind of the tango between the two, which for most developing post-colonial countries might actually be the most likely path of institutional improvement.
Thank you so much. We've got a question from Richard.
Hi, Lucas. Hi. Thank you. For someone, I mean, like with relatively little understanding of the Indian political system, like me, I'm pretty ignorant about it. I wonder whether people just look at it from the outside and think, well, to what extent is this, as you've said, sort of too much government, too much centralization, and to what extent is it a kind of lack of political will to change that? I mean, the current Indian government, certainly, I think in the UK gets a fairly bad press, certainly amongst the sort of the left-leaning press, seen as authoritarian, and perhaps there's a tendency to think, well, it's because they don't want to change. They actually quite like it being a rather authoritarian, sort of Britain in the 1800s style legal system. What the balance do you think between the structures of there versus the kind of political will to change?
I think that's a great question in the sense that for change to even happen, there has to be political will. At the end of the day, the parliament has to pass a law to give away the powers that it has centralized to itself. And therefore, a political case and a political movement has to be built around that. The challenge we face in many of these countries is that the pathways for political will to get created are clogged at some level. If you have these laws which can be used to prevent protests, then obviously it's difficult for people to protest. It's costly for citizens to protest. If you do not have a culture of public consultation, if there are ways for the government to muzzle press freedom, then those pathways get clogged. And we have to, I think, as a country and many countries have to get to a position where the amount of because we bind the government in these systems and processes, the amount they can still do good, but the amount of damage that they can do has to be fairly limited, and that's the point of institutions. But I think who is in power should matter less because the popular will has to find its way to kind of execute policy, and it shouldn't be individual powers. So with that context, therefore, I would say that I do not necessarily think of this regime as necessarily very different. I think of, there are certain aspects in which, in fact, one might even say that the policy environment in India is far more favorable than it was 10 years ago, which, for example, would be on gay rights, that India is in a much better position than it was 10 years ago. But there might be others where people argue it's actually much worse. So I don't necessarily see it as fundamentally different. I think because of the way that we have set up institutions, it allows any government, be it a left-wing one or right-wing one, to carry out an agenda without sufficient checks and balances, and that is something that needs to change.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was a question in the chat that was pre-submitted, which was, what major changes has the Modi government made to the British design of Indian public institutions? What have been the rationales? And if I could add just like a little sub question to that, Subhashish, like kind of following on Richard's question, actually, what should we understand from your argument that is kind of basically structural and has been decades-long evolution of the Indian government, and what are specific things we can identify in this current regime?
Got it. So here's what I would say. If you actually look at all the changes that have been made, at the crux of the institutions, I don't think as much has changed. That, for example, the laws that are often used and are criticized for being used against free speech and journalists, etc., have always existed, and they have previously been used. If you look at, for example, accusations of the government censoring artists and authors, the first book that was censored in India happened in Nehruvian times, and Nehru is considered a great Democrat. But he did ban a book that was critical of one of India's major myths or mythological books. So that these powers had always existed. What one could think about as having happened over time is what one might call the soft guardrails of democracy coming off. And that has in fact happened in the US as well, right? So when you look at this book called Why Democracies Die, it lists two soft guardrails. One is that when you're in power, even though you might be allowed to do something, you don't do it because you think in the spirit of getting to consensus, that might not be the right thing to do. In the US, that means, for example, that when at the end of Obama's tenure, the Senate refused to confirm one of his judges, that was breakdown of soft guardrails. And I think that that has happened in the US, and that is continuing to happen in country after countries. The second is of characterizing your enemy as a mortal enemy of the state. And that is also something that we've seen in the US, with Republicans and Democrats now being more polarized than they ever were. I think there are elements of that we see in India as well. There have been accusations, for example, and who knows how verifiable these accusations are, that, for example, this government might have used powers over the judiciary or over the election commission, which previous governments refrained from doing, to be proven out on whether that actually happened or not.
So just to follow up on that, so in arguing for, how does your argument for the unchangingness of the institutions, given these changes in perception, sit with the kind of argument that we're seeing a kind of global populist movement, a kind of moment, and kind of India is part of that? Are you saying that, do you think one implication of your argument is that that's actually kind of alarmist and it kind of misses the key aspects of institutional evolution that we should focus on? Or is there a way to kind of integrate that kind of discussion of populism across the globe with your discussion of institutional checks and balances?
That's a great question, and thanks for pointing that out. So here's the thing, that I don't necessarily think of these institutions as unchanging, otherwise I would be extremely pessimistic in life. I think of these institutions, however, as having a great path dependency. That because the British set up some institutions in a certain way, immediately post-independence India created a bunch of institutions on similar lines or following similar principles, that became normal. To the extent, for example, this is an example I love, which is when I came to Oxford and I went to get a SIM card and they did not ask me for my ID proof, I was alarmed. I'm like, what's wrong with this country? Why do they not ask for ID proofs? And that's when I realized I'd become so conditioned to this notion that you must provide your ID proof because it is important for law and order, that I never questioned it. And I think that is the path through which path dependency flows. So if today in India, for example, you tell someone that, hey, look, the government is going to decide whether you are allowed to say a certain thing or not, or whether it's hurtful, people will not be alarmed by that. Whereas if you think of it, only the judiciary should be actually talking about or adjudicating human rights and not the government. So it's more about path dependency than it is about the unchanging nature of these institutions. However, that said, I think and this is the argument with which I end the book, which is to say that at the end of the day, all these formal institutions, which is what all my book is about, only react to what informal institutions are, which is the culture, which is the societal norms, etc. And to the extent that we are having a global populist movement, which in country after country, there's a certain othering of a minority group, and that minority group is then painted as a villain in some way. It could be migrants, could be people of different ethnicity or a different religion. To the extent that there's that kind of majoritarian impulse that is emerging across the globe, I do think that institutions over time will tend to catch up. And institutions themselves will become such that they will react to these majoritarian impulses by possibly becoming majoritarian themselves. And therefore, I think it becomes really important to figure out how to start counterbalancing some of it. This is not something I've gone into the book at all. I do not speak about informal institutions. But if we look at where we are currently, there are two ways to think about it. A, that this wave will recede, and as people realize again that, look, in the grander scheme of things, it is only a more tolerant, more plural society that does well. Hopefully it reverses, or we might actually go down the path where country across country, we see more institutions actually eroding. And one might even argue that the US is probably the best example of it right now.
Perfect, thank you. We've got a question from Akanksha.
Hi, thanks everyone for organizing the chat. And Subhashish, thanks for writing the book. Also good to reconnect. I share your optimism about being able to improve institutions over time. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, political will, the legacy of the institution, that is not going to change in the near term. So looking ahead to the upcoming milestone, the elections, right? What are still some wins that are achievable in this time? Like what kind of small changes and political will, how different parties show up, what kind of responsibility citizens have, what are still some achievable things that we can get behind? And what is the role that media can play in furthering the change in mindsets and behaviors to make that happen?
Great question, Akansha. Thank you for sharing it. Here's my primary source of optimism, honestly, is the age of the country, right? At 75 years old or 77 years old, we haven't really had those many years behind us as, for example, the US has had, 200, 300 years to get to the point they have. Britain has had even longer. And I think that's just the nature of change, that if you look even at the US 100, 150 years back, it would be very far from what one might even call a reasonable democracy. So to that extent, I do think I don't necessarily lose hope right now. The second thing is that no matter what your current political setup is, even in dictatorships, there's empirical evidence that a citizenry that is asking questions leads to better socioeconomic outcomes. And this is based on a cross-country comparison. So even if one argues that, look, this is not the most democratic setup, and this kind of is not the most democratic regime, even the act of asking questions in whatever form, shape, or manner actually makes things better. Thankfully for us, it's actually the propensity to ask questions is linked to the education level of the population. So hopefully that is another point of optimism, that as people become more educated and prosperous, they will start asking more questions. That's it. I'll come to the core of your question, which is what is the role of the media and what are some of the victories that we can ask for? I think at the end of the day, the election is just less than a year away. So it's a fairly short time. However, I think we consistently have to ask for exactly the same thing in sector after sector, which is you ask for a fairly well-written law which binds the government itself. One might argue, for example, that the data protection law, the privacy law that the government of India recently passed does not meet that standard. The second is you ask for greater transparency, that at some level, the India's Right to Information Act, which was in fact one of the world's first Right to Information Acts, probably hasn't lived up to its promise. So how do you ask the government to start becoming more and more transparent? And the third is for people themselves to actually stand up and say that, look, I will stand for independent institutions. I think we saw a great example of that in Israel, where there were protests to protect the independence of the judiciary. And to the extent that people across the globe can actually stand up for these kind of institutions which are independent, that's a good thing to do. So look, the change in institutions, there's so many institutions around us, and change will be literally like you're almost chipping away at this block. And that's what we as citizens have to keep doing, election or no election, or elections a year or no election year.
Thank you.
I actually had a question in my mind, but what you just said gave me a lot of new thoughts. So I'm now a bit confused by my own question. So I have to think for a few seconds if anyone wants to jump in.
There's a question from Richard that I can read out, and then
Elena, please come in.
Yeah, I can come in and link it to Richard, because I think when we speak about progressive legal systems and progressive constitutions, South Africa is one of sort of a really good example. But I think a thought just struck me when you were speaking about sort of the general population being the impetus for making a legal system more progressive. I think in South Africa we've got the sort of the opposite, where if you look at our constitution, it's a lot more progressive than if you would put things to a public vote, and that means much greater protection for LGBT rights. So it brings a lot of advantages, but I think it also brings a bit of tension between the legal system and the population side. Yeah, just linking to what Richard posted in the chat, and would like to hear your thoughts.
That I think is again a great question, because there are lots of these contradictions that one has to unravel when thinking about institutions, and this is in fact one of the classic ones, which is it's the same argument that was made in India as well, which was that our constitution was far more progressive than we as a society were. In fact, one of the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution said democracy itself is somewhat alien to the Indian context. And how do you even then start imposing democracy and equality of political voice with a society that is fundamentally unequal? And one of the criticisms that one gets in whatever I'm proposing in terms of doing public consultations, etc., is that you can't hold everything to a vote, right? Which is, if you today say, hey, should the majority have beneficial rights over the minority, I'm sure that will be a very difficult thing to actually mobilize political opinion against. However, the argument I make is around, when I talk about, for example, public consultations, etc., I don't say that the government must always be determined by that majoritarian vote, but to the extent that the government should actually solicit these inputs and then transparently put it out there is an important procedural safeguard for the government to follow. Otherwise, as the media, as concerned citizens, we would not even know what is the political consensus on certain issue. So the ideal way that I see some of these things happen is that a public consultation process is initiated, that the government gets not necessarily votes, but gets inputs, puts those inputs out in public, says that, look, even though the vast majority of you, let's say 70% of you, have supported this particular thing, we will not do it because of XYZ reasons. And the government therefore starts acting as a check on majoritarian impulses. And in case it doesn't, then the judiciary doing that, right? Because at the end of the day, however you design the government is only a representation of the majoritarian will, and it is up to the judiciary in most situations to actually stand up against that. So I think there is that fundamental tension, but I think there are smart ways around that. To Richard's questions about models that India, or I in generalize it, right, any country should follow. Unfortunately, especially we see with the issues that have become exacerbated in the US, that there is no one model. That even what you imagine is the best model has its limitations, and that models will emerge, or institutional designs will emerge based on the context of a particular country. For example, in the 1990s, as all economies transitioned from socialism to capitalism, they started setting up regulators. In fact, most countries are setting up more than one regulator a year. Now, Indian regulators are very different from, for example, the regulators set up in the US. And the reason for that is India's context is very different. In India, courts are clogged and it takes years to get a judgment. Therefore, when India created regulatory institutions, it actually brought in the judiciary, and Indian regulators actually have a quasi-judicial function. That, in a sense, is an Indian innovation, which is determined by the particular institutional quirks of India. So I think to that extent, I don't think there's a particular model that you can just take into an India or a Kenya or a South Africa and say, hey, look, this is what we must implement. I think we have to look at specific elements, argue it out whether that is suitable for the country or not, and then kind of implement it in a slightly iterative way. Obviously, easier to do in regulatory design because those are smaller institutions, far more difficult to do on something like elections. But I generally do not think that I can even make an argument that there's any model out there which is perfect for India or otherwise.
I think I meant not so much, which country and which model do you look at and you think that's the right one to be at, more kind of the process of getting there, the process of rolling back the kind of legacy restrictions that are in there. So, but perhaps not about the destination, but the journey.
Got it. On that, I would probably go back to what Lucas had spoken about, right? Because India's, I think, fundamental challenge starts with too much government in the economy, and that becomes the source of its powers in a way. And to the extent that a lot of East Asian countries have been very successful in rolling back the intervention of the government in the economy, those might be better models. Unfortunately, I guess in the West, not unfortunately, but in the West, we're at a situation where we're asking for more government in the economy. So I don't think that's necessarily relevant for India right now. So I would think of the East Asian countries. And one of the examples I quite like is at the time of independence, India was actually almost as rich as South Korea. And now the difference between the two countries economically is fairly wide. And therefore, I think those kind of countries become quite inspiring, and the Indian government, I think, acknowledges that, and we have a formal look east policy that the government follows.
Thank you, Subhashish. As the last few questions has made me come back to a point that I think, tell me if I'm wrong, I think is important to your book and to your project. It seems like on one level you're discussing the design of specific institutions, and in particular the executive arm of the government. But on a maybe less surface but still kind of subterranean level, you're also trying to, this whole book is kind of about why institutions matter to kind of society in a broad sense, and you're trying to kind of advocate for that. And kind of as you point out, there's no one template, but it's more of this struggle between state and society that gives us these institutions. And I now want to ask you about, so the colonial legacy you've discussed in terms of the continuation of specific laws, for example, sedition or blasphemy that you've mentioned. Do you think that there are also implications or legacies of the colonial history on how the importance or the relevance or irrelevance of institutions is framed in Indian public life, and how understanding the colonial legacy is important for that to communicate and frame how and why institutions matter in the first place?
That's a great question, Lucas, and not necessarily one I've thought about. So pardon if my response to that sounds somewhat incoherent. But here's a couple of ways that I would think about it. That because the colonial project in most countries came to an end with some sort of a freedom struggle, either armed or unarmed, and those freedom struggles typically had a face. That face being Mandela or Gandhi and Nehru in India or others. I think many of these countries are born in that situation where either because the people who have just come into power believe in their own goodness and therefore do not set checks and balances on them, or because the country then starts running on a political treadmill where it starts thinking about, hey, who's the next person who's the savior, right? Who's the knight in shining armor? And I think the entire political discourse in those countries can become extremely individual centric and less policy centric. So that's one. The second, however, is that the key difference between, and this is something I'm just reading now, so I'll probably be extremely immature on this, but the key difference in the legal systems that emerged in the West and then were kind of went into the other countries and across the globe, vis-a-vis those that emerged in the East was, and this I'm talking about the ones that emerged in the West in the kind of Middle Ages, was a lot more constraints on government, was binding the government in a lot more rules than, for example, ancient systems that had emerged in the East and that had remained relatively unchanged over the years did. So to the extent that we are even talking about institutions, we are even talking about putting constraints on the government, I think we owe a lot of thanks to what happened or the process of institutional building or constraining the government that happened in both the US, UK, and other Western countries. So to that extent, I think there is both a positive side, which is the freedom struggle most freedom struggles made us very individual centric. And there's the positive side, which is that, hey, look, this entire legal system of checks and balances at the end of the day emerged first in the West, before they did elsewhere. So I think it's in that sense, a double-edged sword.
Thank you so much. I just have a quick comment in response to that, but I just want to say that we're about 5 minutes out from the hour, so please open to anyone's last questions for Subhashish. While you think about that, I just wanted to quickly respond by saying that if I don't misremember, you used the term founding fathers for in the book at some point to talk about the key figures in kind of the post-colonial moment in kind of, I hope I'm not misremembering, but the connection between the individual personalities and the kind of policies that they're advocating for does seem to be very different in each society. In the kind of founding moment, to call a generation founding fathers or mothers or whatever, you actually see that there's a very different degree of attachment to the people's policies that they advocate for. And that might tell us something about this question of how and why institutions matter or don't matter. Okay, so I get to ask the last question. So congratulations on putting out this wonderful book. And I hope, I hope lots of people read it. So I think to wrap up, I would be very interested to know of the kind of feedback and responses you've gotten so far from various readers, audiences. What has most surprised you?
I think what has most surprised me has been the lack of very harsh criticism. And the reason it's surprised me is because when I was actually bringing out this, or in the process of writing, a lot of people who wished well for me did say that, look, it is these are contentious issues to talk about in an environment people might perceive to not be very favorable or not be fully favorable to freedom of speech. And I think people were certainly very worried about that. But here's why I think that did not happen, because I think it's my choice of talking about institutions in the context of liberty was very deliberate. I very deliberately chose not to talk about people and personalities, even though they are extremely important, and I acknowledge that literally in the first chapter. But I chose this focus on institutions because I wanted to sidestep the polarization that is often seen in society. So to that extent, the fact that there were lots of people from the Indian government, not the political part of it, but the bureaucratic part of it, who reached out and said, "Hey, look, we heard you talk about your book. We read your book, and we want to have a conversation about it," was for me the most surprising part of it, because I obviously thought that there might be a certain amount of defensiveness, but I did not see it. In fact, someone I knew said, who works in the government, said, "Look, my boss said we should give a copy to everyone in the office." So that kind of reaction really both surprised and made me very happy.
Very glad to hear that, and very glad to end on an optimistic note. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Subhashish, for sharing your time with us and your thoughts and your book, Cage Tiger, published by Bloomsbury. And lots of ideas in there, and I hope this conversation has been interesting for everyone.